What if there was a book, let's call it Ars Notoria, that allowed you to learn faster, retain more, and I'm talking about retaining complicated matters related to geometry, astronomy, logic, grammar? What if you could do that just by looking at some of the images in the book, maybe meditating on the names of some astral beings like angels and whatnot, and then going to lecture hall? Because, it's kind of a practical study guide. It does want you to actually attend class, read the books, and so forth. But imagine that, just by doing this additional activity of looking at some symbols and contemplating on some names, you would be able to outpace your peers, to learn faster than your fellow students, and accomplish your goals so that when you pass your exams, you are rapidly accepted into the higher echelons of society. There is such a book called Ars Notoria, and I couldn't think of anybody who could help us take a tour into what it is, how it affected the society in which it was most important, than Dr. Justin Sledge from Esoterica. If you don't know Justin and Esoterica, it is an extraordinary resource for history of science, history of literature, specifically related to what we call Western esotericism. And in this discussion of Ars Notoria, we talk about the ins and outs of what this text promised and how that it may have fulfilled at least some of that promise and why. Now, I'm a little bit sympathetic to this promise and the idea that it fulfilled it, but it's not necessarily without its cost. So if you have read my book, The Victorious Mind, you know that I memorized a ton of Sanskrit in order to get the benefits of basically a quieter mind. But there was such a thing as the dark night of the soul. And as you'll learn, there are some people who used the Ars Notoria and went a little bit crazy. And I think that perhaps they may have experienced something like a dark night of the soul. So if you're going to play around with these things, the reason I'm mentioning this is because I do have some experience with it. It is a bit unsettling, but there are places like Cheetah House that you can go to. So I would just throw that in there as something that is quite important, because there are effects when you absorb anything into your mind, pros, cons, etc. And I want you to be able to dive into a text like Ars Notoria and be able to have a wonderful experience with it. And if anything goes awry, which it certainly can when it comes to matters of the mind, you have a resource to go to. So with that in mind, let's dive into the richness, the nuances, the promises, and the potential problems with being able to learn faster by looking at images, diagrams, ruins, and contemplating on the names of angels with the extraordinary learner and educator, Dr. Justin Sledge from Esoterica. Justin, thanks for joining me on the podcast to talk about Ars Notoria and your work at large. So for people who don't know you, just maybe say a little bit about Esoterica and how you come into just this wonderful deep dive into so many fascinating texts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on the podcast. My name is Justin Sledge. I have advanced degrees in religion and philosophy. And my specialization is in Western esotericism, which means I have the great luxury of reading a lot of weird books all the time. Mm-hmm. And so this would be things on alchemy, magic, Kabbalah, witchcraft, the witch hunts. It's pretty broadly construed. So that's what I tend to focus on. And I run a channel called Esoterica, which is an academic channel focusing on the academic study of Western esotericism. So it's a lot of fun to be able to dive really deep into some of these really obscure books that I think get pretty badly misrepresented often by people who are either malevolent or misinformed or both. And so it's really great to be able to dive into these books and provide people academic analysis of the history of the occult or mysticism and things like that. So just for people who are just casually interested in, it's great. There are people who come to the channel looking to build out their D&D world, which is really great. There are spiritual practitioners who are learning a little bit more on the academic side about their spiritual practice, which is really fantastic. So it's just a real blessing to run the channel, and it's been successful, and I'm really, really thankful for that.
Well, in that context, maybe it's good to talk about this a little bit, because I certainly don't have
any particular beliefs in any of these things. And I think you've talked a little bit about the difference between studying a thing, practicing a thing, believing a thing, and so forth. So maybe before we go into the deep end of angels and demons and whatnot, we can say a little bit about that. Like, how do you divide that in your own mind? And why is it that some people in the world can't? They think, instantly, maybe they're not malevolent, or maybe they're not even misinformed, but they're just not scientific. Maybe, is that the word we would use? Or
yeah, I mean, I think that one could be a believer in occultism and be a good academic. I know people like that who are believers and good academics. I think you can be a bad academic and also be a believer, and be a disbeliever and also be a bad academic. They don't logically imply one another. But at least from my perspective, I come at this. I'm not a believer in esotericism or the occult or anything like that. I'm Jewish, but I'm Jewish in a Reconstructionist sense. So I don't believe in any form of supernaturalism. So for me, it's a purely academic interest, which sort of cuts in two ways. On the one hand, I hope that it allows me to be a little bit less biased, because I don't have an axe to grind when it comes to this stuff. I'm not a practitioner of magic and believe in a specific school of magic, and I'm sneaking my biases in that way. Not that I don't have my own biases. I do, of course, and I try to check them. And so it means that coming at it from this academic perspective, which also has sometimes a weird kickback for people who are believers, because they get somewhat angry at me because I don't believe in the material and I'm producing content about it, which I find odd. It's a funny thing to get kickback about that, or that I'm getting out all the secrets that everyone doesn't want me to get out, which is hilarious, because I'm like, look, man, if your secrets are available on archive.org or amazon.com, it's not my fault.
Right.
You dropped the ball somewhere in your court. You dropped the ball. So in that way, it's great, because I get to interact with people who are believers. I get to interact with people who are skeptics. I get to interact with people from a range of things. And the idea ultimately is that if I'm doing my job right, I can interact with both of those camps with respect and with academic rigor, and not have to compromise my values and not have to denigrate anyone else's values, which, God willing, if I'm doing my job right, then that's what I'm accomplishing. And I hope I do that. I'm sure, like everyone else, I'll fail at it, but I hope I do it.
Well, I certainly think so. I mean, not here to compliment you to death, but I think what you're doing is excellent, and it really is, to me, a wonderful reminder of the best of going to lecture hall, and even better in some sense, because there's a dense compression. So not only does it give me a sense of great educational experience, but also this enhanced back to the past sort of feeling when I used to be a student at university.
Yeah, and we're living kind of in the educational Wild West when it comes to internet education, and it's just a really fun experiment and basically crowdsourced education. As you know, there's only one degree granting institution in the world that allows you to academically study Western esotericism. And it's all the way over in Amsterdam. That's where I studied, and there's nowhere else in the world basically to get this kind of education. And it was the great genius of my brother, actually, who was like, you need to make a YouTube channel. Like, people want to know about this stuff. Like, you could do it and people might support you. And, thank goodness they have. And the channel's successful. So that's really a boon for me. And it's great. I think that for those of us who have advanced degrees, sharing our knowledge in a way that makes it accessible to people who otherwise couldn't get access to it, for me, that's a vocation. That's a sacred duty in some sense. I'm really glad to be able to do it.
Yeah, it is a great duty. And speaking of all these things in Ars Notoria, one of the things I'm so grateful for is people ask me about it. And then finally, randomly, somebody sent me that you had done the Ars Notoria, which I hadn't seen. And I don't have the theoretical, historical, or religious grounding that you have to wax messianic or any other way on what's going on in this text, really. I mean, I can see a few connections to Bruno and Lowell, maybe, but that's
certainly Lowell.
Well, yeah, but it's just guessing, basically. So maybe we can say a little bit, just what is the Ars Notoria to begin with, and then get into some of the grounding, so to speak, around it.
Sure. So the Ars Notoria is a collection of literature, right? So it's not one book, really. Sometimes we think of it as one book, but really it's a collection of literature that's primarily aimed at the magical, rapid acquisition of knowledge, particularly knowledge that is the kind of things you would learn in the medieval education system, the quadrivium and the system of medieval education. And it was written sometime in the early Middle Ages. There's some debate about exactly when it was written down. What we have in the Ars Notoria is a collection of rituals, incantations, and then these things called the noti. And the noti are magical images that are, in some manuscript traditions, filled in with magical words. These are typically thought to be the names of angels. We don't know what they mean in many cases. And you stare at them, or really you inspect them. And this is the Latin word really has a sense of meditate upon them. And somehow or the other, by meditating on these noti, one rapidly gains acquisition of the liberal arts. So rhetoric, dialectic, there's a significant range of things one can learn. Allegedly learn from the Ars Notoria, theology, philosophy. One could even learn magic, which is ironic considering that one would have to know a little bit of magic to be doing the thing. But I guess you learn more. The classic geometry, the kind of things you would find in the medieval education system. And it's not the first text like that. There's actually a Jewish tradition as well of Jewish magic in which one learns rapidly rabbinical literature. This is called the Sar Torah, the Prince of the Torah literature. And we think there's some connection between them, but we're not sure. They could have both arose independently. I think they probably did. But basically, that's what the Ars Notoria is. There's a slightly different version of it called the Liber Visionum, the Book of Visions. That's a slightly more sanitized, Christianized version that actually was developed by a monk who attempted to use the Ars Notoria. He kind of halfway did it, which you should never halfway do magic. You can imagine that can go off the rails, and it did. And he had all these terrible visions and things like that. And so he developed an alternative system that's much more Mary focused, in which the Mary, Jesus's mom, provides you the information rapidly as opposed to you mucking around with a bunch of angels.
Right.
So that in a nutshell is what it is. There are dozens of these manuscripts that have been recovered. This was a very popular form of European magic. It stretched for centuries. It corresponds to the rise of the university system, obviously, there in Paris. And we have it consistently being condemned by church officials. And of course, every time we see it condemned, that's a pretty good indication that people were using it. It also is said to generally improve one's memory, one's intelligence, one's eloquence. And so by doing it, you kind of get these generic skills, but you also get, by staring at these noti, inspecting these noti, one rapidly acquires knowledge of grammar, for instance, which if you've ever had to, study whatever 15 declensions of a noun in Sanskrit or Latin or whatever, we would all benefit from rapidly gaining some grammar knowledge. But that's basically in a nutshell what the Ars Notoria is.
Right. So thank you for that. Now, lots that you mentioned there. Is it John Maringi that you're referring to, who went a bit crazy, or is that how you say it?
Yeah,
Maringi?
yeah, it's John. Yeah, John Maringi. Yeah, he's the guy that wrote the Liber Visionum,
right?
The Book of Visions, which also survives, and it's its own separate, independent manuscript tradition.
So what I'm wondering, I mean, you have a great video on it, and I kind of want to avoid repeating things that you say in there. And I think you just gave a decent overview of your video, but I want to encourage people to watch that, and I'll have a link for that to go through your full video on Ars Notoria. But what I want to kind of poke around with is to what extent this is maybe some kind of wish fulfillment, or, I mean, Claire Fanger thinks that, and this is something that lights up to me as a definite possibility, that something in those rituals would be something like a training that I do now today, which is to help you better make sound associations and literally alphabetical associations, in the sense that if you had to memorize something that started with the letter A, then you would use like an angel that also starts with the letter A in just basic mnemonics. And so the story of, I think it was John Maringi's daughter or cousin or something like this that was actually rapidly acquiring something, she speculates that there may have been some sort of mnemonic benefit essentially from these exercises. So I'm wondering to what extent that this might fit into the scope of things like Rhetorica ad Perennium with its memory training, some of the Lullian associations with letters and concepts of benevolence and so forth that Bruno later just goes nuts on, basically.
There, he builds a whole system of the art of memory.
Yeah.
This is a big debate because the problem with the Ars Notoria as a manuscript tradition is that it is, like all magical manuscript traditions in the Middle Ages, it's badly corrupt. Which is just to say that from manuscript to manuscript, you don't get consistent transmission of a lot of these, for instance, angel names. And in fact, not only do you not get a stable transmission, the Ars Notoria is actually an evolving manuscript tradition where there's a very early tradition that's very compact. That early tradition gets a commentary later that expands how to do it all. And typically it's built into the actual manuscript. And then there's a later commentary that's sort of further built into it. And every time that happens, corruption sinks in. And so if it were a situation where we could see that, I don't know, dialectic clearly had some completely logical relationship to argumentation, that it said that we had all the different forms of medieval argumentation, right? With, the various kinds of what's a good example? The Aristotelian square of opposition or something. If we could see something like that consistently through the manuscript tradition, which sometimes we see and sometimes we don't, it's certainly not there in the earliest text, then we could really get a handle on what's supposed to be going on here. Because then we could say, oh, this is a kind of Lullian art of memory, or some kind of a association system where you have a bunch of angels that have the mnemonic reminders of various forms of argumentative structures, or I don't know, when you memorize, you turn all the Latin declensions into acronyms so you can memorize how they go or something like that. I don't know. The manuscript tradition is just too corrupt to be able to say that is the case. In fact, the earliest manuscripts don't even have the angel names inside of the notae. That's a later tradition. In fact, and then you get pictures of angels in later tradition as well. Further, it's also worth pointing out is that sometimes people think that you just inspect the images and you magically get the information. But the text assumes that you're attending lectures. It actually says you have to continue attending lectures, which would have been read out loud, right? They're not lectures like they are now. It's literally Thomas Aquinas with someone reading a book out to you and then commenting on the book as he's reading it. So it really is a lecture in the literal sense of that word. And also it assumes you're still studying. So it's not that you forego lecture and you forego studying and you just magically get this. It's that this is an addendum to help strengthen that process by kind of rapidly getting it for you. And what's the way I would say this? I tell people, I write about 3,000, 4,000 words a week in terms of writing scripts for Esoterica. And sometimes people say, how can you pump out 4,000 words, a week or whatever? And I'm like, well, you get good at writing by writing. And it's the very act of writing that you get right. You get good at it. Ditto with holding your breath. You get good at holding your breath by holding your breath. And I would suspect, same with memory, right? The more you memorize, the easier it is to memorize things. And so I would suspect that what we have in the Ars Notoria is something like what we might now call mindfulness training, where you have a very elaborate set of rituals, you have a very elaborate set of things you do in a very structured way. And because you're structuring your entire life around the rapid acquisition of knowledge, at least for a 4-month period, that what it requires in the Ars Notoria, it seems likely to me that that's what the system is doing. That everything else, all of the notae and all of the specific aspects of the Ars Notoria are actually incidental to that structuring process. And it would seem unlikely to me that if one structured one's life in a way that the Ars Notoria requires, that you wouldn't probably end up learning faster rhetoric or dialectic or grammar or whatever it is, faster than your peers.
Right.
So that's my guess. I think it's a structure. It's a scaffolding, and that scaffolding just actually structures your time, structures your intention, structures your day in such a way that you're getting up earlier than everyone else. You're going to bed later than everyone else. You're really focusing hours and hours a day on inspecting these images, but around of that, you're also studying constantly. And, in the 15th century or, the 13th century, if we know anything, if you study what the lives of medieval school was like. It was raucous. People were drunk all the time, brawling. Prostitution was out of control. People were playing dice and killing each other. I mean, because once you study at the University of Paris, once you got the tonsure, you were exempt from secular law. The police literally couldn't arrest you. They had to turn you over to the church to prosecute you. And people think of the Middle Ages as an incredibly pious period, and in many ways that it was, and in many ways it wasn't. And the students of the milieu that produced this form of magic were pretty bawdy, the Goliards. These are the poets that are writing Latin songs to be played in taverns while they gamble and drink and attend to, prostitutes. And these poems make fun of priests. They make fun of the mass. They make fun of, And so if that's your competition, or those guys, and you're studiously staring at these things and late into the night and studying all the time, yeah, you're going to outperform your peers, right? I think you're going to outperform your peers. It's not hard to outperform the drunk guy, the medieval equivalent of the party animal. So that's my general thinking, is that it's a mindfulness structure, and that the corruption in the manuscript tradition actually doesn't matter that much, because as long as the structuring is happening, then the byproduct will be a more rapid acquisition of knowledge, especially vis-a-vis your peers. That was a long answer. I apologize for how long that was.
Not at all.
That's my general take on what's going on there, which would be interesting because one could scientifically test this. I mean, the Ars Notoria is well understood text. We could put 10 college kids on the Ars Notoria and 10 of them on the Knot, and just run some tests and see what happens. My money is that the Ars Notoria college kids would get real weird, but would get smart too.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that. There are tests that aren't like that necessarily, but they relate to that. I mean, even 2 years ago, they had one where they had some medical students just use a courtyard at the university as a memory palace, and they were given some associations, and they remembered all of these rather complex terms quite well, and that's without the benefit of mindfulness. And here, even if you're just inspecting something, you still have like a spatial memory training that's going on as well. But one thing, I think the mindfulness stuff would totally play out, and I think I just wonder to what extent that raucous world that you just painted for us, also there must have been a lot of additional physical suffering that people dealt with that we don't have, and that must have created some solace as well. And I just wonder if there's more to the picture, like the production of these kinds of texts, that is also just a coping mechanism for dealing with the material body that doesn't have the access to health that we have now.
Yeah, I mean, certainly medieval cities are not a place I think anyone in their right mind wants to visit. People who tell me I'd love to go back to the Middle Ages, I'm like, you'd be dead in hours. It's a brutal world, just the amount of pathogens that are around. And also, these manuscripts are not easy to make. These, if you get a look at some of these noti, there's a degree of draftsmanship that goes into their production. They're not just hastily drawn. They're very carefully geometrically constructed. And I think that the process of producing a book like this also is getting you in the mood is not the right word, but the mindset that one is about to embark on a serious 4-month-long, intense period of knowledge acquisition. And I think and I'm a calligrapher, I've copied long things. I've copied long sermons of Meister Eckhart. And when you copy something that long and do the work of the draftsmanship to produce a noti, and then you really live in that world, I think you're in altered state of consciousness at some level compared to people around you. I think that you're in a different headspace. And I think that headspace that you're in greatly facilitates learning. And one can wonder, I mean, can you learn all of grammar and logic and dialectic and astronomy in 4 months? I don't know. But I would say that if one were to attempt this, I can't imagine that you're going to be in a headspace of just normal, casual students, so to speak. and again, we have in the text, many of the text, admonitions, right, to students. This was a book produced by students, probably for students. And so it's very much wrapped up in the university world of the University of Paris. And again, we know it was used because we see it constantly being condemned. There's constant, do not use the Ars Notoria, do not use the Ars Notoria, forbidden to do magic. In fact, they had to, and I think in 1398, they had to release a school-wide condemnation of sorcery because it was so rampant in the University of Paris. And they had to go through and like, you can't do necromancy, and you can't try to talk to the dead, and you can't summon demons, and you can't try to look at these Ars Notoria. And if you're caught with these books, you'll be expelled. So this was a thing that was certainly being practiced by the student population. And I don't know. There's a part of me that says that if it doesn't work at some level, people wouldn't do it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's my general thinking. And the fact that we see it being copied so many times, and we see it so ubiquitously through the medieval university system, it had to have done something.
Well, you excite me when you mention Meister Eckhart, because that rings a little memory bell in my head. I think it's the 19th sermon where Eckhart's talking about the 4 kinds of nothing. And I think he's referring to maybe Acts 9:8 there, where Saul rose up from the ground and saw nothing. And then he's speculating, like, what would that nothing mean? And he has these 4 kinds of nothing. So I was going to ask you this anyway, but since you mentioned Eckhart, this is maybe a better way to ask that, because when you think about the Ars Notoria doing something, maybe it's actually doing nothing, which is helping people experience non-duality, which would, in our contemporary setting, be messing with the orientation association area of the brain, which makes it impossible or harder for one to distinguish self from other, which comes from sitting like this, maybe praying and reciting things from memory and so forth. So I wonder if part of what makes that dangerous could be some sort of caused experience of non-duality, where they're experiencing one of the 4 kinds of nothing, or maybe more.
It certainly could be. I mean, I've never, I'm not a practitioner myself, but it seems to me that part of what one does in the Ars Notoria is that you recite out loud these long lists of these angelic names. And these angelic names we can see some elements of Hebrew in them, we can see some elements of Greek in them, but mostly they're nonsense, right? We can't find any rhyme or reason about what in the world they mean. And I would suspect that when you're repeating things like that over and over and over again, and you have to repeat them over and over again, they become mantra-like. And I imagine that in the same way that the chanting systems that work all through the world are part of a mind clearing and a mind sharpening process, it would be totally unsurprising to me if that weren't also part of the mental technology at work in these texts, which, precisely because they don't mean anything to the people reciting them, they can be more powerful in this way. And so that seems possible to me. But as to speak to the exact phenomenology of what would have happened to these students, or I have no idea.
Right.
I don't think I've ever met anyone who's actually ever attempted the Ars Notoria as a practice. And part of the reason why no one has done it is because there are no reliable complete English editions out yet of it. I think one's coming out next year, so maybe we will have some people experimenting again with the Ars Notoria, which I would love to be on the kind of, panels or whatever that look into those kinds of things. I think it's you don't have traditions that survive for hundreds of years without there being something there. And that's, to me, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, the closest I know is Martin Fox. I mean, it's close, but not the Ars Notoria, but Martin Fox memorized the Bruno wheels, and he turned them on a live seminar. They were literally asking him questions, and he would take the B and wind it up with the I or whatever. Is there an I in there? However it all works. But it was quite interesting. But he already is quite a meditator, so I'm sure he was already there before embarking on this. Well, you mentioned, the role of the book as a physical object, and doing some of the writing as perhaps part of this effect that's being created. Say a little bit more maybe about books. I mean, we both got piles of them behind us. Is it like that for them, or is it a room with one book? And just how expensive, do we have a sense of how expensive books were? back then?
Very expensive. Yeah, incredibly expensive. Acquiring a single book was incredibly expensive. For instance, students didn't go buy textbooks in the Middle Ages. What they had was called the Peccia system, where you had basically a blank book of your own, and you would take it to the bookseller, and they would have a copy there of, let's say, Aristotle's Metaphysics. And you knew what your teacher would be lecturing on. And so you could see the pecs where the teacher would be lecturing, and you would copy that out for yourself. And you basically pay for the time to copy it out. That became your textbook. You wrote your own textbook. Because if otherwise you had to pay someone to do it, and it was skilled labor, and it was very expensive. So producing something like the Ars Notoria would have been a very costly endeavor. And some of the manuscripts were incredibly beautiful. And so someone paid a bunch of money to have some of these manuscripts produced, probably very wealthy aristocratic students who could afford to do it. But yeah, the average student had a book, and typically that was the Peccia notebook that they have. And if you want a nightmare, try to read some of them. I mean, they are heavily abbreviated. Even if you know Latin, even if you read medieval hands, they are writing as fast as possible. They're abbreviating as heavily as possible to shove as much as possible into those books to cut costs. And they are just a nightmare to read. They survive in the thousands, by the way, which is really neat that we have a lot of them. Okay. But this would have been the kind of book that I think only would have been available to, aristocrat students. It may also have been the kind of thing that maybe people rented out, that someone had a copy and they rented it out for a season, and maybe you paid a pretty penny for having access to it. But we don't know a lot about the owners of these books, with the exception of John Morngy, right? Because it went off the rails for him. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it did that, I don't know if he had some kind of pre-existing mental illness or whatever. It's possible. But it could also be the case that, when you're doing these magical things and you're meditating and you're staring at these strange symbols by candlelight, I think you could kind of lose it. I think you could kind of slip into a mental state that could be, pretty terrifying. And in the medieval imagination, that's going to be filled up with all kinds of demons and things like that. So it's not shocking to me that it could go off the rails for someone who's not gone through the process of ritually purifying themselves in the way that medieval people really held to be really important. But the book itself is a substantial text, and it requires a great deal of like I said, draftsmanship to really produce these images. Mm-hmm. Not the kind of thing I as a calligrapher, I wouldn't want to be tasked with doing it. It would really take, I would say, working 8-hour days, a month, maybe more, to produce a volume. It's a substantial volume.
So when you're doing calligraphy, what kind of thing does draw you and excite you that you would go through something of that extent?
For me, at least, it's a kind of a spiritual practice. I mean, it's a way of clearing the mind and focusing your attention on the very tip of the pen, and that's basically all there is in the world. Is the word I'm copying. You copy very slowly, and there's just the word and the pen, and that's it. And the world kind of compresses itself down to the razor thin ductus of the quill. Mm-hmm. And that process, for me, clears my mind. It's sort of a way of me engaging in kind of a silent meditative practice. And also it connects me to the people that I admire. These medieval people are people I have a great admiration to. And the act of copying is as much about producing something beautiful, because it all just ends up in my desk. Whenever I die, people are going to inherit my family's going to inherit a bunch of weird stuff written down. But it's also an homage to them. It's a way of saying, no, we're going to keep the light on, because this is, there's something spiritual to me, even as a person who would identify as an atheist. There's a spiritual thing about copying these profound works, things like Meister Eckhart, and then really closely meditating on them by literally copying them letter per letter. So I find that to be illuminating.
Right. That sounds like a very good one. And I'm sure elucidating too, in terms of getting a deeper grasp on maybe luminous details that sort of come out of having integrated with the actual production of meaning, as opposed to the consumption, which is always a kind of production, but this is a sort of deeper material level.
Reading can be passive in a way. I mean, you can get passive about it, especially if you read a lot. You can be really skimming. And when you're not just reading, but copying slowly by hand, you're really swimming in the sea of every single word. And a writer like Eckhart, he did not I'm just giving an instance. I copied out his whole sermon on hunger, and he did not waste words. He was a very careful writer because he knew what kind of danger he was in the kind of things he was writing. And so you see the care put into every single thing he's doing, and that's inspiring.
Well, these things are not entirely lost. I think it's Kenneth Goldsmith is his name, in maybe Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania, and probably University of Philadelphia. Maybe he's got the School of Uncreativity. You can actually watch him present at the White House his ideas of uncreativity, and he has his students choose a text to copy by hand.
Mm-hmm.
And then the assignment is the original assignment, so to speak, is to write an essay about why they chose that text to copy by hand. And so it's not totally lost to us, these exercises in your own experience. I'm just wondering a little bit more about the danger that the culture found with this. Is it because it's trying to control God or spiritual forces? Is that the main issue, or is that a form of blasphemy to try to do that? Or
I think that's the anxiety. Typically, when this text is condemned, it's condemned mostly because one is able to, in a mechanical way, force God to give you the information. And obviously, the idea that you can twist the arm of God, so to speak, is it's blasphemy. I don't medieval people, no, God is all powerful. God is not going to do something mechanically because you've stared at something long enough. That's just not the way God works.
Right.
And so the critique is not the rapid acquisition of knowledge. The critique is that it's theologically compulsive, and that's incompatible with basically all medieval conceptions of how God operates. But in every other way, the text is completely pious. In fact, if you were to follow it, I think you would be probably the most pious Catholic on your block, because it requires constant prayer, constant ablutions, fasting, going to mass every day. I mean, it really is a text that demands a kind of spiritual athleticism on the part of the doer of it, which I don't think one can amputate away. I think that that some people want to say, well, you could just take out parts of the Ars Notoria and make a secular version. I'm like, I don't know if you can actually, because it's so heavily integrated into the medieval Catholic world, where it literally assumes that you can walk from the cathedral to your study chamber. That's just a default assumption that it has. And so I would say that that's the big beef that the theologians are going to have with this text, is that it seems to be a kind of mechanism for forcing the hand of God to illuminate you with these various topics. And obviously that's incompatible with I think most Orthodox Catholic teachings or Jewish teachings or Muslim teachings, which is interesting because the Jewish version of this, right, the Sar Torah literature, which predates it by several centuries, in that case is actually an angel that does the teaching. And so that kind of skirts around the idea that God's not doing it. It's just an angel you're basically hailing, and that angel will descend and teach you these things. So in many ways, that text, we don't know how popular it was ever in the Jewish world. It does survive in manuscript, so it's popular enough. That text wouldn't have the same theological baggage, I suppose, but that's the reason why the Ars Notoria. And there's even some manuscripts in the Ars Notoria where it does say that, just FYI, God might not do this in the end. Like,
right.
And I think it's a backdoor, basically. It's kind of like the little mark at the end saying, just FYI, this isn't heresy. But I think that no theological authority at the University of Paris is going to fall for a disclaimer. I don't think that was going to work.
So my understanding is so vague in this era, but it seems like the schools themselves are playing a dangerous game, because if there are restrictions on what you're supposed to think, and specifically with divinity, let's say, why did the quadrivium include math and astronomy? I mean, that's just begging for contradictions and so forth. So I don't know enough about how trivium and quadrivium even come to be, and then specifically how astronomy, maybe even geometry gets into hot water in being there. Maybe even music gets into it, because music is geometry in some sense.
Right.
So I'm just curious. Do you have that same question in your mind?
Yeah, the medieval world is always, what is this, the quote, right? The past is a strange country. And I think it's really strange in the Middle Ages because we have this image of it of, if you step out of line, they're going to burn you alive or something like that. And that's just really not the case. You could doubt things. We know people doubted things. The thing you couldn't do is publicly teach heretical things. You could not teach something contrary to the official teachings of the church, and you couldn't teach something that was an innovation that was not allowed. But there was otherwise a lot of latitude in the Middle Ages. And so, to the point where, at the University of Paris, they had to basically pass condemnations at various points because the teaching was getting so out of line that the Bishop of Rome, or the Bishop of Paris, and the King of France had to intervene. That shows you how avant-garde the University of Paris could be. They had to go through these purges. So on the one hand, teaching rhetoric and dialectic and argumentation and logic, one would think that would produce an army of would-be heretics. But it didn't. It didn't. Mostly because there was no world outside of, aside unless you're Jewish, right? Basically, there was no world outside of the Catholic worldview. In the same way now that we don't really have a lot of people really thinking far outside the box. It's not, most people, I don't know, they assume all kinds of basic metaphysical things. We don't have, I don't know, how many metaphysical dualists are running around these days? I've never met one. I'm sure they're out there, but they're a tiny minority. And so you'd be surprised that now most people basically believe within a standard deviation, basically the same set of metaphysical beliefs. That was even more true in the Middle Ages. You had to really, really want to step out of line to do that. So I think that medieval people, like now, mostly grouped together and self-selected. And I think that people did have sometimes heterodox beliefs, and sometimes they did argue them out, and sometimes they were condemned. But rarely were they prosecuted for this kind of stuff. The main thing I would think of here is when you begin to cross the line into, that's a good example. It's when you begin to cross the line into straightforwardly blasphemous or practically heretical things. So a classic example of this would be learning astronomy, right? So learning astronomy was set out basically by Aristotle and Ptolemy. Astrology was accepted. Astrology was taught in the schools. And so that was fine. But medieval people often thought, all of them thought, that the world above, between the earth and the moon, was populated by demons. The demons lived between the earth and the moon. We tend to think of them living in the hell underneath the earth, but that's more of a Protestant idea. The Catholics, they thought of them as living primarily in the heavens. And the idea was you could not only learn what was going on in the sky, but through various techniques, you could control those entities living in the skies. And this is called astral necromancy. And it was at that moment we have commentaries on texts, astronomical texts, where people say things like, well, you shouldn't and you can't, by orthodoxy, manipulate demons in the sky. But if you wanted to, here's how you would do it. So Michael Scott famously wrote one of these kinds of things. And then Cecco d'Ascoli wrote one as well. And Cecco d'Ascoli, really, basically his commentary on the spheres is basically an astral necromancy manual. I mean, it survives. And he was arrested and told, look, you need to recant of this. Here's your chance. Just don't teach people this stuff. And he had some bad political connections, and he doubled down on it, and they burned him alive. He's one of the few people that actually got burned alive for these kinds of things. And it probably had more to do with his political mistakes than it did the necromancy stuff. So you had a lot of latitude. I think you had a lot more latitude than people think. And then we can do this by looking at how many people were prosecuted for using the Ars Notoria. We see it being condemned constantly. Not a single person was on record ever being convicted of using it and then punished. So either people got slapped on the wrist. I mean, imagine it's sort of kind of like drug use on college campuses. It's endemic. Everyone knows it's going on, but no one's going to go hard on the potheads. It's just not, So I imagine it's illicit, but no one's going to come after you, probably, unless you make a big show of it, and then they might. But again, we don't have, the Inquisition was active at that time. We have very little evidence of prosecutions.
What is the goal with the knowledge? So let's just say you were granted all of the quadrivium in a week or so, then what? You get a degree, and then what? I mean, are you Dr. Illuminatus like Lul, or and then what? What does that mean for you? Like, what's the attraction to?
Well, so at this time, right, what's happened is that in a big city, you need bureaucrats, like any city, right? And what was happening in the University of Paris, and Paris specifically, which is where the real milieu of where this stuff really comes about, is that before the University of Paris is founded, all of the education is being done in the cathedrals. And that's basically for training priests, right? Well, we need you to be literate like the priests are. We need you to know some things the priests do, but you don't really need to be an active priest. That is to say, working in a church, officiating at the mass every day. What we really need you doing is at the deed office, composing deeds or settling disputes or writing out documents or whatever. And those people, by the way, they got trained over across the Seine on the left bank at the University of Paris, what is now the Sorbonne. And that's a secular institution, right? Secular institution. By the way, we still call them clerks, and you can still hear the word cleric in it, right? They're still kind of tied to this institution. And those clerks, they're going to get an education. They have to get basically the same education the priests do. And then they're going to go on to work for basically the city of Paris, or they're going to become a private business person. And some of these private business people, especially in the city of Paris, could make a ton of money. And there's every reason to believe that if you could rapidly get out of school, you would go into the job market and you could make a bunch of money. And people made fabulous sums of money. I mean, it is amazing. Like people, for instance, who worked in real estate and in the 13th century, Paris grew at leaps and bounds. I mean, imagine a city, this is the fastest growing city in medieval history. People made a ton of money as that city grew. And the people making that money are going to be the kind of people who are these clerks. And so, let's update it, right? Let's say that I could rapidly get you to learn all the things you need to learn to go work for Google and become, a mid-tier person at Google, making 200 grand a year, 300 grand a year, something like that.
Right.
If I could tell you that you could do that in 4 months, as opposed to the 6 years of a medieval education, you try it. You try it. And so I think that, and people do, right? There are all kinds of schemes and programs for rapidly learning C++, or rapidly learning differential equations, or rapidly learning computer science, so people can rapidly get in the job market and make a killing. I think it's the same kind of thing that's been motivating people for a long time. I think it's the rapid acquisition of knowledge in the interest of inculcating yourself into medieval Parisian yuppies. And in fact, people got so wealthy, by the way, at this time, that they gained their wealth so fast that people basically accused them of being alchemists, that they must be converting lead into gold. There's no way you can make that much money that fast. Nicolas Flamel, the most famous example, he made his money so rapidly that he became accused of alchemy. And to this day, most people know him as an alchemist, although there's no evidence of him having ever practiced alchemy ever. He was in real estate.
Right.
He was he's a real estate tycoon. But people just couldn't imagine. Again, we're talking about the feudal period. We're talking about people living in poverty most of us can't imagine. To go from basically being nothing to a hugely wealthy person, that's so beyond most people's imagination that they had to assume something supernatural was happening.
Right. But the Ars Notoria, there's not an addition for real estate people, or you would only get in real estate through some sort of clerical institution. That's the idea.
Yep. Yeah, that's it. That's the only game in town. And it'd be the kind of thing that, again, imagine the kinds of things that if you want to be a good mercantile person, you need literacy, you need math, you're going to have to argue your points, so you're going to need rhetoric. You're going to need, you're going to have to pass theology exams. You're going to pass, the other kinds of exams. So it's the kinds of things you're going to have to jump through the hoops anyway. So why not jump through them in 4 months as opposed to 6, 7, 8 years, right? To go through the medieval education system, which was very boring. I mean, literally going into a room, listening to people read to you, right, and then sometimes argue about it and sometimes not. It's it is a much less engaged educational system, and it was rote. You were expected to do it by rote. In fact, the term professor, right, comes from the idea that one was trusted to profess teachings of the church publicly.
Right.
That's where it comes from. And you couldn't be trusted to do that unless you'd been vetted by basically passing a bunch of theology exams. And you had those theology exams. And if your eyes were on becoming a medieval merchant or a medieval real estate broker or a medieval whatever, lots of things you could be, you still had to pass those exams. And in the same way that I think, I have students now who I teach at a technological institute, and these young people are going to go build robots. And they're in my philosophy class because it's required. And I guarantee you, if they could just magically pass my philosophy class and get to the building of the robots to get their job at Ford or whatever, they would do it in a heartbeat.
Right.
And so I think the same kind of thing is motivating student interest in the medieval Ars Notoria. It's dirty deeds done dirt cheap. Get them done and be out of there.
Right.
So
right.
I think that's what's going on.
Well, that's an interesting maybe segue into yourself as a learner. You mentioned you have quite a good memory for books, but maybe in other areas it seems not so great. I think in some sense we've sort of covered this. You mentioned that you're almost certainly going to have better skills at concentration if you're concentrating on something, and better memory skills if you're memorizing something. So maybe say a little bit about the path from becoming a scholar or going through the scholarly rungs, so to speak, then becoming a professor, and then how that translates into what you do. I mean, you essentially have an online sort of university production, and I can't imagine that every single text you read is so exciting. I mean, you must have strategies for dealing with boring books and
of course, yeah.
Volumes
and
of them,
even the weird ones are still kind of boring. I mean, it's only the 15th alchemy book. You're like, all right, another alchemy book. Yeah. So I guess a weird fact about me is I didn't talk. I had it took me a while to learn to talk. I talk very late compared to my peers. And I don't have any memories from that period at all, basically. I and even to this day, I have virtually no internal monologue. I can sometimes be sitting, I'll sit down in a chair and I'll blink and like, it'll be dark and hours have passed and I've just been sitting in the chair. I don't try to do it. And it's like I'm meditating or anything, but I'll kind of be like, huh. And I'll blink and I'm like, oh, it's dark. I'm sitting in a dark room all of a sudden. So an hour or two can pass, and this is just the way that my mind works. And so another artifact that's strange about the way that I my memory works is I see pages of books. So I see the entire page and I can zoom into certain sections, and certain sections are blurry and certain sections are clear, but I typically see whole pages of books. And so that means that I have a pretty strong memory of the books I read. I can think of, oh yeah, on that page, it'll say that, or in this footnote, that's the reference I need. So it's quite easy for me in many ways to compose things really fast as long as I have some background knowledge of them. But if we were to have a conversation over dinner, I would not remember it a day later. Right. Like I would not, this is much to the chagrin of my wife, who's like, we just talked about that like an hour ago. And I'm like, we talked about an hour ago? She's like, we talked about it for an hour. And I'm like, damn it. So yeah, often conversations don't stick, and so it's a funny trade-off, right? Some people are like, yeah, I would love to have your memory. You could just like know exactly on what page this thing in Pico is. And I'm like, yeah, but the trade-off is I've met people, talked to them for 3 hours, and then be like, hi, I'm Justin. They're like, yeah, we met. I'm like, crap. So maybe the kind of thing where maybe I'm on the spectrum, I don't know. I've never had a diagnosis or whatever that means. So they could be like a spectrum kind of thing. It could be, I don't know. My mom does tell me that sometimes when people would ask me questions, because I was in elementary school, I was in the gifted class half the day and in special education half the day, which is an interesting circuit. And my teachers would sometimes say, yeah, he doesn't say anything, but sometimes you ask him a question and he'll just quote an entire episode of He-Man. Like the whole episode, like all the characters talking. I don't remember doing that, but apparently I did. And so that, again, that's a strange thing of my memory. And so I'm not quoting He-Man anymore. Now I'm quoting Cornelius Agrippa or whatever it is.
Right.
So it's a peculiar memory. It's probably an artifact of just my, whatever my neurostructure is. Who knows? I'm not sure.
I have a cousin like that. He would watch a show and he'd be quoting it, like repeating vast swaths of it for forever. I don't know if he does it anymore, but when he was a kid, he used to do that. But that kind of framed that way kind of raises an interesting question. I think it's for me in what I do, I think it's the most uncomfortable question, but also almost the most necessary one, which is, and it sort of skirts with something we were talking about before, like, one can study these things and not believe in them, but yet at the same time, I feel more and more this kind of thing of no free will evidencing itself in many ways, that we have our minds the way that we have them, and then we have luck and chance that just kind of puts us in these positions. And then if we're so fortunate to have positions like people like you and I have, where we have, YouTube channels and ways of being able to focus on our texts, it almost feels like, wow, this is meant to happen. And there's some sort of guiding force, and it's almost seductive in that sense. So one of the things that attracts me to the whole Ars Notoria thing and John and Marigny and that sort of stuff is, I, as almost, I would say, a previously militant atheist and now like a non-astrologist in the, the sense that it's just irrelevant to me. Why even have a label to all these sorts of things? But at the same time, the more I practice myself, I feel this kind of strange pull where I almost worry I'm going to go off the deep end like some of these people and start to believe in something. But at the same time, these proclivities that one has, and then falling into positions where you're able to do the work one does and enjoy it and so forth. I just wonder how you frame that, or do you have empathy for believers in these things?
Of course,
from that sort of perspective, or?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the God hypothesis is eminently reasonable. Again, I would say it's reasonable to believe in it. It's not reasonable enough for me to believe in it. I teach philosophy of religion, so it doesn't strike me as reasonable enough, but I would never tell a believer or a theist that they're irreasonable. I would take issue that, that maybe it's, the evidentiary bar that they have is perhaps lower than mine. And maybe I'm just wrong for having a high bar about that issue. But if I'm going to posit a necessary being, it's going to be a pretty high bar, evidentiary speaking. But I don't think it's unreasonable. I think it's what people do with it that worries me. It's when that becomes a justification for, I don't know, being a bigot or something like that. To me, that's crosses the line. And I, of course, would challenge that kind of stuff. But I teach philosophy of religion. And, I tell people my job is not to make you believe one way or the other. In fact, if you don't know what I believe, then I've done my job the best I can. What I want to do is give people the skills to think for themselves. And if they come out on the other side believing in God, fine. They've come to a reasonable conclusion based on the evidence presented to them. And if they come out an atheist, fine, because they have come to a conclusion based on what's reasonable in terms of evidence. So for me, when I think about my relationship to, God or what might be motivating all this, I think that, how did I end up here? It was a series of accidents. I grew up in a working class family. My dad was a pipe fitter. I worked as a pipe fitter. And I met a professor once randomly at a coffee shop when I was reading Hegel, of all things. And the professor was like, if you go to this place called college, we'll give you money and you can read that stuff, and we'll pay you to read it. And I was like, that's a bunch of suckers. And so, and I took him up on it, and eventually, I tell people it's a complete accident. I was on one side of the podium, they kept giving me money. Now I'm on the other side of the podium, and they keep giving me money. But to what degree that was being driven by the cunning of history or divine hand? If it were, God certainly has a weird sense of humor. That's the best I can say about that kind of being. That they have a very Coen brothers kind of sense of humor or something.
Well, maybe there's a text there that you already know, or that will be discovered, the ontology of accident, something like this.
Right. Yeah. It's always, sometimes I even say that maybe the old Gnostics were half right, that the God who created this world is kind of crazy. I've always found that idea interesting. Some Lovecraftian being is responsible for all this, but no, it's, I feel the same way. Is that when I think about questions around God, to me they're philosophical questions. I'm a religious person, I really take seriously my religion, but yeah, the God question just doesn't grab me. Sometimes I refer to people for whom the God question is not a live question for them as apatheists. They just don't care about apatheists. They just don't care about God.
I love that.
Yeah. So people might be an apatheist. They're just like, I just don't care about that question. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. Since you mentioned Lovecraft, I think it's in Cthulhu, there's this wonderful line where he's talking about the beings coming, and he says, and they brought their symbols too. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is almost this Nietzschean moment where, you make them gods, but you forget that the symbols were built by you, and you sort of forgotten that you built the symbols. And the horror is in remembering that or even just unconsciously intuiting that all of this is a production of this human driven to do something, because there are just physical laws that force us to do stuff. And then we just create stories around it and so forth. So that idea of they brought their symbols too, just seems to me like that's kind of that naked lunch moment where you see what's on the end of your fork, and that's where I think
right.
The Cthulhu stuff is truly scary in some sense.
Yeah, and I guess I think of that same line actually, and that's part of what not ruined it for me. But I was like, why would they? We mediate the world symbolically. Mm. Why would they, if they're really otherworldly? Why would we assume? Why would Lovecraft assume that they do? Because like we're semiotic creatures, but there's no reason to believe that whatever those things would be. Yeah, I love semiotics. I teach semiotics, and it's a great sort of interesting thing to think about, like us as creatures for whom the world is mediated through representation. That idea, I think, is just infinitely fascinating to me. Which is also why I'm very sympathetic to the stuff I read. I don't go to the alchemist or the Kabbalists or the occultist in order to disabuse anyone of their beliefs or to make fun of these medieval people, even though I think that they're fundamentally wrong. But I don't feel the need to abuse them, because what they believed was completely reasonable given the symbolic world that they lived in. And so when I look at these guys, I'm like, yeah, the alchemists were the most reasonable people on the block. There's no reason for me to look down my nose at medieval people, yeah, and I think that's part of what motivates why Western esotericism isn't more widely studied. It's that we inherit not only the values of the Enlightenment, which I'm very on board with, but the prejudices of the Enlightenment, which I find to be really gross. And so now one can wonder, can you separate those? I think one can, but I think that amputating ourselves from our intellectual ancestors because they were wrong at some level, I think that's going to pay really poor dividends. I think that means that we're going to have an intellectual amnesia, and I really don't think that we could. I don't think that's a good idea for our species.
No, well, it seems there's something the internet is pushing us towards something like that, this eternal present, in some sense, where representation may be just what's happening now. Who knows? But you mentioned something about not having thoughts, or just basically what I understood as not having thoughts. And I don't know if you're aware of the term persistent non-symbolic experience, or PNSE. And when we think about semiotics and so forth, I mean, how would you know that you've had such an experience if it itself didn't represent itself? Or is that the wrong way of looking at it?
Yeah, I would say that it's because of the time passing, where it'd be the kind of thing where Malebranche said that if God wanted to pause time for 1 billion years, God could have. And there's no reason to believe that moments are connected through causality. That's a metaphysical assumption, not a thing we've proved. Right. Hume famously argued for that, and Kant says we can't know if it's really real. For me, it's just the phenomenology of time passing, where I will I'll be sitting in my chair, or I'll be laying on the couch and thinking, and I won't go to sleep, but an hour will pass, and I'm like the other day it happened. I was here by myself, and we have a little radio downstairs, and it plays the classical channel because that's what I like. And at 7, the jazz music comes on, and what ended up happening was I was laying there on the couch thinking about some philosophy thing. I'm not sure what it was, but at some point I just stopped thinking. And when I came to, it was getting dark and jazz was playing. And I was like, hold on. When I laid down here, when I sat down here, that was an hour ago, or an hour and a half ago or whatever. So 45 minutes passed, and I wasn't asleep. I distinctly remember being awake, but there was no internality. There was no there's a kind of passive being or something. So I don't know. It's a state of mind that I've talked to people about, and people say things like, "Yeah, people pay a lot of money to go to retreats to try to learn to do that." And I'm like, well, it seems to me often a waste of time. It's like that's an hour I could have been reading or whatever. But it's a weird artifact of how my default phenomenology is basically kind of off.
Well, it's interesting that there's so many different experiences. I mean, there's a thing called aphantasia where people don't have a mind's eye, and I've had something like that, or I would say, yeah, well, I don't have a mind's eye. I mean, pictures hang on walls. What do you mean, see pictures in your mind? But at the same time, I often think, what a great gift to not have stuff, just imposed upon you in your mind. So
I hear people say they have racing thoughts and things like that, and I guess if I'm stressed out about something, I might have that. But the idea that I would have racing thoughts, or I have students who have intrusive thoughts or things like that. It's a very strange and foreign idea, and terrifying to me. That people could have this this internal monologue that they can't turn off, and not only can they not turn it off, but it's intrusive and harming them. That to me is maybe one of the more terrifying thoughts I can conjure. But in that way, I'm lucky that I haven't had that experience, or don't have that experience. And but I can't say that it's something like meditation or something like that. I haven't done anything to deserve it. I don't think it's a I don't know. I've never really talked to a person who've made sense of it. Although I've talked to other people who also were late language developers who've experienced the same kind of thing. And it could be the case that my language acquisition is just different, and therefore it doesn't. There have been cases where people have had strokes and they've lost their first language, which is typically round up in Broca Wernicke's area, but they'll have a stroke over here and they'll disable their first language. They won't have it anymore. But if they've learned other languages, they can still speak in, German or something. And so I wonder sometimes if my language skills, because they were acquired so late or so unusually for whatever reason, are just actually just functioning differently in my literal brain. But I have no idea. I suppose I get an MRI or something.
Well, if you ever write a book on these things, then maybe good to get a brain scan to include in the book. Which would be cool.
I mean, it would be unsurprising if they did it and they were like, yeah, you have a lesion on Broca Wernicke's area or whatever. Which is interesting, because one time I was at the dentist, and dentist was like, you must have been really sick at some point when you were little. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, yeah, you must have been really sick. And it was like he could see something in my teeth that would indicate a pretty significant illness. And sure enough, I went home to my mom and I was like, was I ever sick when I was a kid? She said, yeah, you had a brief bout of meningitis when you were a kid, when you were a baby. I'm like, why didn't you ever tell me that? She's like, well, you got better. And I was like, well, that might explain something. I mean, it could be the case that I just have brain damage, actually. And that the plasticity of the brain worked itself out, but otherwise, I don't know. I really have no idea.
Well,
no idea.
Maybe by way of tying this all together, admitting that maybe none of us ultimately can have any idea, especially about things from the past. Maybe this idea that you could just learn really quickly, like in a flash. John Dee, Enochian, and then maybe John Dick with Philip K. Dick, with xenoglossia. Like, we have these kinds of things where people at least talk about or have even produced vast amounts of material. Like the exegesis of Philip K. Dick is just like massive amounts of text. Like, where is this coming from? Yes, he was trained to type. I don't know enough about Enochian to ask like a really super specific question about it, but I wonder if we tie this together with Ars Notoria, the idea that, you know, spontaneous learning or very rapid acquisition of something, and then material versus some sort of spiritual or otherworldly thing. I mean, what happened there with this, with Enochian and all of that?
The Enochian stuff. Yeah, that's a big conversation. Basically, over the course of April to July of 1584, Edward Kelly, the medium working for John Dee, was able to generate, either through supernatural means or natural means or con artistry or something. No one really knows. There's a lot of theories about it. But he was able to generate psalm-like texts in a hitherto unknown language, and not glossolalia, so not speaking in tongues. That's very recognizable. Linguists easily recognize glossolalia, but in a language with grammar and syntax and vocabulary. It's extraordinarily, maybe one of the most extraordinarily strange moments in the history of Western esotericism in general, because we don't know how he did it. We don't, assuming that it's not angels talking to him, we have a little bit better understanding of it now. I've written on it some. I just actually have done some episodes about it. And we can now see that there are linguistic structures based on root words that are typically taken from Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And then they're mutated in ways over the course of about 250 words. And this generates a rough vocabulary of about 1,000 words. And he composed psalms in these texts. And some of these texts are revealed backwards in reverse order. So no matter what happened in those Enochian sessions, they were a feat on the part of Edward Kelly, who wasn't a trained linguist, he wasn't a scholar really. His Latin was never really good. He was notary. He was a notary actually, and he was a fraud. He actually had his ears clipped for coin forgery. He had his ears cut off. So he is a complicated guy, and I think that saying, "Oh, it was just a con," really misunderstands how complex it is. And also, I think what saying, "Oh, it was just angels," there are lots of reasons to believe that it's not just angels, that there's things going on here. And it's somewhere between a con and revelation, I think. And the text in that way is really, really, really weird. And I don't think simple explanations for what happened in those sessions are they're not going to explain the totality of what happened. But yeah, we have Kelly up to doing, with Kelly engaging in magic. He's a notary. Maybe he knew the Ars Notoria. And what we have is this record left behind by the accident of history. It's completely discovered by accident. Right. Dee hid it before he died, and it was discovered by accident. And we have this text of roughly 1,000 words. The calls are just over 1,000 words. And it's one of the great endearing mysteries in terms of Western esotericism. And it's fascinating in that way. It's really fascinating in that way.
Well, I think through the magic of the internet, I can have appear at the end of this a link to one of your videos on that topic, or otherwise down in the description, so people can follow up on more detail on that. But I can't help but feel that they are, if not actually connected, thematically connected in terms of that sort of spontaneous production of knowledge, and super fascinating how it all weaves together. And just thank you so much for doing this.
Absolutely. This material, whether you believe it or not, it's part of history. It's a part of how our minds were shaped. It's a part of how we intellectually evolved in our civilization. I think that it deserves its day in the sun. And again, historical amnesia doesn't benefit any of us. And I really find this material fascinating and illuminating. It teaches us a lot about ourselves and how we got here. And it's not just what people used to believe, but it's also how beliefs get formed and change. And that stuff is eminently worth understanding.
Yeah. And when you frame it in terms of digital amnesia and just cultural amnesia, etc., that importance shines through even more, because we're in a very strange moment when it comes to that. So thank you, and power to you for what you're doing with Esoterica. And again, thank you for this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, and this really a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Justin Sledge again for his extraordinary knowledge, his insight, his wisdom of the context surrounding Ars Notoria, the text itself, and a heads up that another version is coming out, so we can all check it out. And I just want to reiterate that these experiences that some people have, they can be quite profound and potentially unsettling. So there are things like Cheetah House if you get into that and it feels a little bit weird, because it can. I mean, if you experience what some people call ego death, which may have been what occurred from some of this intense meditation on images and the names of astral beings, etc., it can throw you for a loop, and you might not know exactly what to do with the feelings that emerge from that. So Cheetah House is there for you, and I would hope and assume would be just as receptive to these effects arising from Ars Notoria, from the ancient world, as they would from something like the Sanskrit that I memorized that's here with us today. And I think one of the big takeaways from this, and I'm so grateful that it came out, at least in tone, if not tenor, through this discussion with Dr. Sledge, is that a lot of the world has changed, but a lot of it has remained exactly the same. And to get more of a grasp on not only the truth of that statement, but also the benefits of that statement, I highly encourage you to go and visit Dr. Justin Sledge at his wonderful Esoterica project. It is so rich, so rewarding, and I myself have barely scratched the surface, but I absolutely love that production of amazing texts that he has discussed and analyzed in such an extraordinarily careful way that just gives me so much nostalgia, I guess, for my university days, but also the elucidation and the edification of someone who knows their stuff and is willing to impart it to you. So, with that in mind, I put on the screen here somewhere a link to Esoterica. It'll be down in the description below. Please check it out. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about books like these and the ideas in them and the ideas that Dr. Justin Sledge and I talked about today. Thank you, as always, for watching this channel. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.